I think we'll just sit up here, Rob, if that's all right. How are you? Be good to catch up later. I think we got told.
Welcome, friends. My name is James Ensor. I'm the Chief Executive of the BHP Foundation, which is a foundation that aims to catalyse new solutions to the world's most complex social and environmental challenges. And we currently operate across 65 countries around the world. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on Wurundjeri country. We are very close to Birrarung, which is also known as the Yarra River, an important meeting place for Indigenous peoples over thousands of years. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, to those who've led in the past, those who lead at present, and those emerging leaders who we will lead us into a future Australia of committed reconciliation. It's our pleasure to partner with the Australian Red Cross to deliver today's event, and I'd like to acknowledge Ross Penny, the President of the Australian Red Cross, and other distinguished guests. The BHP Foundation and the Australian Red Cross have been partnering to build a more resilient Australia for a number of years, and particularly in the face of increasingly destructive and frequent natural disasters. This is because we live at a time of unprecedented challenge in humanity, and a time of what some describe, you might have heard, as polycrisis. Whilst the last century has delivered extraordinary human progress, more than 1 billion people continue to live in poverty, and the natural systems upon which our common future depends are all under unprecedented stress. So the combined forces of climate change, increasing inequality, the COVID-19 epidemic and conflict within and beyond Ukraine and other current conflict locations are increasing socio-economic and environmental volatility around the world. We're now seeing the outcome of that increasing volatility in the form of increasingly frequent and intense humanitarian crises, which are testing the limits of human resilience in many parts of the world. So as a result of that, at the BHP Foundation, we've shifted our humanitarian response work towards a resilience-based approach. Through this approach, we focus on supporting organisations and initiatives that invest in resilience-led approaches to both socio-economic and natural disasters. For example, in Australia, we, together with the Red Cross, have recognised the increasing fragility of communities impacted by natural disasters and the importance of building resilience. And we're proud to have partnered with the Australian Red Cross in their community-led resilience work in response to both droughts and floods, to build that resilience capacity in response to these increasingly frequent and intense crises. In Chile, we've supported an initiative called the Dialogue Table, which was stood up in response to the 2019 social crisis. This initiative developed tools that created spaces to enable and promote dialogue as a peaceful means to approach conflict resolution, in particular through elevating the voices of women community leaders to articulate community priorities to government and to others. So this approach manifests in different ways in different contexts around the world. Our philosophy as an organisation rests on a belief that complex problems demand urgent responses, and collaboration within the humanitarian sector and across sectors is critical to success. And that is the purpose of today's event. Within that context, I'm delighted to welcome our guest of honour, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Robert Mardini, along with Australian Red Cross Chief Executive Kym Pfitzner. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just take a moment to briefly introduce them both to you. Firstly, to Robert. As the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Robert is responsible for steering the organisation's global humanitarian activities in more than 100 countries. Not a small task. Kym took up the Australian Red Cross Chief Executive role in January 2020. Prior to that, his experience has been in leading large-scale, complex multinational organisations across Sydney, Singapore, Shanghai and other locations. Facilitating today's conversation between Kym and Robert is Yvette Ziegenhagen from the Director of International Humanitarian Law at the Australian Red Cross, who's worked for both the Australian Red Cross and the International Red Cross over the past decade. Before I hand over to Yvette to lead us in the discussion with Robert and Kym, just some housekeeping. Toilets, if you go around to where you came into this area and turn left, you'll see toilets down the end of a corridor. And if you hear, and in terms of an emergency, if you hear an alarm go off in the room, we'll be joined by a fire warden, so you stay where you are and just prepare to evacuate, and you'll be directed by the fire warden outside the front entrance and to make your way to Collins Street. So without further ado, to the real reason we're all here, I'll hand over to our distinguished panel.
I think I've got this one. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and welcome to Robert and also to Kym, but you have not travelled quite so far to be here today. I think I was thinking about today, it occurred to me that last month the ICRC marked its 160th anniversary, and next year Australian Red Cross will mark its 110th anniversary. So one is the old, and might I both say you're looking remarkable for your age. So one is the oldest and largest international humanitarian organisation, the other the oldest and largest humanitarian organisation here in Australia. Both born out of war and both still passionate, trusted and credible authorities and champions locally and globally for greater humanity on the battlefields of the 21st century. So with that in mind, I think if my maths is correct, our speakers today are leading organisations that cumulatively represent 270 years of humanitarian action in some of the most difficult and complex crises on the planet. And I say that to encourage you to not hold back with your questions. We've got two people here that are able to give us some really deep and thoughtful insights into the humanitarian world as it stands today. So what I thought I would do today, or to start off with, is ask a couple of questions of our panellists before opening it up to the audience. Robert, I imagine that you have encountered enough Australians by now to know that we are pretty laid back. So I would like to make this as conversational and informal as possible. So please, chat amongst yourselves, but also really encouraging as much participation from the audience as possible. You are also our guest of honour, which means that I will make you work the hardest. So once we have had some questions for both of you and from the audience, I've got a couple of questions on my list as well, specifically to direct to you, Robert, around the work of the ICRC in conflicts around the world. So we'll get started. The first question is that you both come from very diverse backgrounds. So Robert, you're an engineer by trade, and Kym, you're a corporate executive. So I'm interested to know what initially interested you and drew you both into the world of humanitarian leadership. And Robert, we might start with you.
Thank you, Yvette. Good afternoon, everyone. So that's... Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much, Yvette, for the introduction. It is true I'm an engineer by training, but before that, I was born and raised in Lebanon, a country that was torn by conflict. And I was able, with my family, to navigate the conflict and sustain education despite the war. And I could see firsthand the role and the impact of the Lebanese Red Cross and the ICRC. And I think that has certainly shaped my childhood and gave me insights on how the Red Cross can really uphold human dignity in the worst of circumstances. And when I left Lebanon, when I was 18 years old and went to Lausanne in Switzerland to study engineering studies and starting working as an engineer, at one of those enterprise student forums at the Swiss Technical School for Engineering, I saw a stand of the ICRC, and I asked myself, what on earth is the ICRC doing in an engineering school? Because in my, recollection, the Red Cross was a medical organization evacuating wounded during armed conflict. And by curiosity, I went to ask the question to the person who was holding the booth, and he told me, well, ICRC hires engineers because in armed conflict, access to water is absolutely critical. And I had a click in my mind, and I recalled my childhood and the importance of ICRC, and I said to myself, maybe it's time to give back. And I threw my hat into the ring. I applied, and I got a job, and I went as a first mission to Rwanda, where I worked on water supply projects in prisons and also in cities in the aftermath of the genocide. And this is how the whole thing started.
And the rest, they say, is history.
Exactly.
Thank you. And Kym, what about yourself?
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Robert, for that. It's probably three factors of that. The first one, it's Australian Red Cross. How could you possibly say no? So that's the first factor. The second factor is, as Yvette touched on, I come from the for-profit sector. And probably the last 15 years of the for-profit career, I had a real tug or a real push, not quite sure how you describe it, a desire to put back. So it was something driving me, and as an organisational leader, I always try to make sure that would occur. And that's quite difficult when you're running for-profit organisations because you've got market share and profitability in stock markets to worry about. So that was a real push. I think the third thing as well is in that career, it's always been people-based organisations. And always these organisations, like the Australian Red Cross, had quality people, like the organisations you all come from, and those quality people, to ensure that they succeed, or that organisation to ensure they succeed, ensure that those quality people work very closely together as a team, that they collaborate, that they actually are quite innovative in their creativity for solutions to clients. It's also surrounded constantly by highly intelligent people. I must say that I wasn't the most sharpest tool in the shed around those people, probably more than I care to admit. But those combination of all those things, which very much does mirror the Australian Red Cross, that is why I found my way to the humanitarian sector.
Great, thank you, Kym. And I think it's an interesting reflection that you've both come from such different backgrounds and yet leading organisations within the same Red Cross family, given that when we track back to the beginnings of the Red Cross, its foundation was from people from very diverse backgrounds as well. So you both actually took up your current roles in the same year, in 2020. So we're 2 years and one global pandemic later, and I'm wondering what two issues there are now that keep you both up at night. So Kym, over to you for this one.
We were actually, Robert and I were talking about this morning, how we started in lockdown. Robert in Geneva and myself in Melbourne as well. So I don't think there was a playbook how to run an organisation from a digital screen on a home office, but now history, as we now say. I think probably in the scheme of things, it's really the rising needs in its humanitarian needs in Australia, but also around the world that's impacting Australia, and how we as the Australian Red Cross and indeed the movement meet those rising needs. That's probably the thing that keeps me the most awake. And as a consequence, a linked component of that is really when I look at our very large and complex organisation, what are the factors that really are that are necessary that keeps us going? And that's when I look at it, I'm quite concerned it's fatigue. And the first area of that is donor fatigue. You know, we're constantly asking donors, there's constant disasters, there's constant ask. And secondly, because of that, there's also a lot of donor competition as well. So quite concerned that, you know, we have to have funds to do what we do, that there's lots of fatigue. The second component of that fatigue is really around the fatigue of our Red Cross people, our members, our volunteers, our staff, and also within the sector. I know there's a number of sector people here today, and I'm sure they can agree as well, is it's just been constant and people are highly fatigued as a consequence. Probably incredibly driven because they're humanitarians, but nonetheless very fatigued. And the final component, I know that's 3 rather than 2. I was never very good at mathematics. So the final component really is about our transformation, our organisational transformation, which actually links to the first component, which is really about the rising needs. And how do we transform this rather incredible organisation here in Australia to be ready for the future? And I'm sure it keeps me wide awake. It certainly keeps our COO, Lloyd Doddridge, who's in the crowd, awake at night as well. So that's 3 things that keep me awake. There was one final thing. So I was actually going to tell a bit of a joke, and I didn't know whether it was appropriate, but I will say the other thing is Ross Pinney, our chair of the board, ringing me. That keeps me awake at night as well. So sorry, Ross.
He's nodding, so no. And Robert, what about you?
Well, we had this conversation with Kym this morning, and many of what he just said really resonates a lot with us at ICRC. And I think the global one that really keeps me up at night and with my leadership team is really the very complex equation of unresolved armed conflict, going protracted, rising humanitarian needs, and the macroeconomic landscape, which makes it extremely challenging to be able to sustain a response over a long term. And this is, I mean, it was very interesting to see how much the challenges that you face, Kym, very much resonate at ICRC. There are 2 other important ones that I would like to share today. And one of the reasons why I had to delay my arrival in Australia was the fact that on Saturday in the morning, in our delegation in Mali, in the northern part of the country, one of our teams was intercepted by an armed group, and 2 of our colleagues, a surgeon and a nurse, were abducted. This is for an organization working on the front lines of conflict. This is duty of care, which you mentioned, Kym, really resonates across the board. And there are no more complex time when you know that one of your colleagues is in harm's way. Of course, it's a moment where the entire organization connect, and we activate our crisis mechanism. But this is always a defining moment, and it's also part of the risks, the incompressible risks of being able, as a Red Cross, to make a difference in those circumstances. Another thing that keeps me up at night is the growing risks of cyber attacks. A year ago, the ICRC was the victim of a very sophisticated cyber attack that compromised the personal data of more than 500,000 people. Of course, this incident shook us to the core at ICRC, because our work is about building trust with people we serve, with communities, and when people entrust you with their personal data for humanitarian purposes, when you have this type of incident, it's of course devastating. And of course, today we know that there is no industry that is immune from this risk. And however you invest, you can only do so much, and you remain a potential victim of cyber attacks. So of course we had to beef up and step up our cybersecurity defense. But this is of course something that would be extremely painful if it were to happen again.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's no surprise that some of these challenges are the same because, of course, whilst we're independent organisations, we are part of the same movement. So, of course, a challenge for one is a challenge for all. And those implications, for example, with the cyber attack, you know, there are reverberating consequences. Yeah. So my last question before we go to some from the audience is a bit of a left of centre one. The question is, if you could swap jobs for a day, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to one another? I'm never going to be put in charge of a panel again. Robert, over to you.
Well, I think I would say to Kym, think one Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. Because as you rightly said, Yvette, we all share the same brand. And of course, the Red Cross family is made of today 192 national Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, their secretariat, which is the National Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, and the ICRC. But for the vast majority of people on planet Earth, this is the Red Cross. So, you know, any great things happening is a plus for the family, and any liability is a risk for the entire family. And I think we need to have those reflexes as always, you know, representing the entire movement in everything we do, domestically or internationally, because the world is so interconnected that anything that happens in one place has a bearing on the brand and the reputation and the authority of the Red Cross movement everywhere.
Good advice.
Thank you, Robert. Great advice. And just on the previous one, you know, thoughts with the missing people, the ICRC as well. Thank you for that advice, Robert. Probably two pieces of advice from me. The first one is be nice to the new head of the ICRC, please.
I like that.
And then the second one is totally agree with what you just said, and I had to quickly scramble to think of another point. So I think what I'd say is taking from very much the United down to an understanding of the organisation here is also to recognise, I know you do, but recognise the Australian Red Cross is a very complex organisation, and I like to see it as a very large onion with attitude. It's got lots and lots of layers to it, and you've got to peel the layers away to really understand the organisation. Take the time to really understand. It's a stakeholder, members, volunteers organisation. A lot of stakeholders here today. We survive on our social licence, which is the general public's willingness to support us and be very, very aware and cherish our social licence. And of course, you're an expert in this, but also the importance of the fundamental principles of our movement, and particularly the reinforcing here in Australia as governments change over regularly from time to time, is the reinforcement of that we actually are auxiliary to government in the humanitarian space as well. So I know you know them back to front, but you chose my option. So thank you, Robert.
Great. All right. So I've now got a question that I'd like to ask you that has been pre-submitted from one of our audience members. So, and the question that was submitted was, noting the increasing complexity of the world in which we are working, what insights could you share about the type of leadership you feel is required to support humanitarian and disaster responses in today's diverse conflicts? And Kym, given you have a background in organisational leadership, I will hand to you first.
Wow, what a great question. To me, there's two dimensions to this question. The first one is, how would the organisation lead in a more complex world? And the second lens, if you want, is how do I and the leaders in the Australian Red Cross lead in what is a complex and increasing complex world? So I'll take the second lens, because the first one is really a strategic positioning. So I'll take the second lens, is what leadership characteristics do I lead with, do the leaders of the organisation lead with, that internally will permeate externally as well. And we could be here, because I noticed Dr. Jill Klein is sitting in the meeting, and she is my leadership professor from some time ago, so hopefully, Jill, I'll get this right. It is probably two forms of style of leadership, because it's a very complex world of it, as you said. It's getting more and more complex as time goes on. The depth of the complexity is becoming very interlocking as well. So I think, first of all, we need to have a very strategic leadership style, which is really about lead with the heart. So the heart is humanitarian, the head is business. So instead of seeing the two as opposite ends of a continuum, you're either humanitarian or your business, they actually come together to ensure the humanitarian capability is amplified as a consequence of that business discipline as well. So that's probably the first type of leadership. So because you've got a very complex environment, you need that strategic thinking to be able to lead through it. The second type of very much approach, Yvette and Robert, is really around inclusivity, so inclusive leadership. And again, complex worlds means you can't do it by yourself. You can't know everything. You can't rely on 3 or 4 people to be the sages and know. It actually means that everybody in the ecosystem should be asked for points of view. They should be asked for opinions, and more importantly, decision-making should be informed as a consequence of all the feedback. And as part of inclusive leadership, is really to constantly review the decisions you make based on the feedback coming towards you. Now, it has the word inclusive in it, so it means inclusive and diversity is not a focus. It actually is a fundamental. So very much about how do you include people in, how do you listen, how do you actually contribute, and how do you co-design, which is a point that James and I were talking about before. And that then permeates externally. So the organisation internally, the leaders are doing this. It means we as an organisation then do the same thing. And we are a very inclusive organisation, but then it's replicated internally, externally. And that's a very powerful equation of it, I think. So I could talk for hours, so I'll stop now.
No, thank you, Kym. And I think that idea of inclusivity, of course, is also reflected in our principle of unity and being open to all as a national society.
Correct.
Robert, over to you.
I would really endorse what you said, Kym. It really resonates very much, and maybe add a thought that I think is something that all purpose-driven organizations share. I mean, working for the Red Cross or for any humanitarian cause generates a lot of enthusiasm, emotional connection to the purpose, and this is great. And within the movement, we have very strong principles of humanity, of impartiality, neutrality, and my experience is being in a purpose-driven organization is a blessing, but it's also a curse, because similar to the private sector, every staff member feels as a shareholder of the organization. So he or she feels that she has a say on everything. And because of the notion of purpose-driven and greater aim, normally there is a tacit understanding that results by all means is something that is okay. And I think we've seen recently in the wake of the Black Lives Matters protest that there was also suffering within the organization, because some colleagues were bullied, some people were not invited at the decision-making table, and despite the diversity of our organization, we have more than 100 of different nationalities, inclusion was not really there, and this created a lot of suffering. So we had to invest as an organization of, okay, we have the great principles of the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, but what are the values that should define the way every staff member has to follow to treat other colleagues? And I think this is an important one in leadership, to be able to listen and to be able to give psychological safety to people to come forward and also express some of this malaise or difficulties people sometimes are struggling. And of course, another one I would add in terms of leadership is really to pivot into a servant leadership, a leadership that is here to serve people, and to remove obstacles for colleagues, to innovate, to dare, to take calculated risks for the greater aim of the organization. And listen to the young people, because very often this is where great ideas come from.
Great, thank you. I think we'll now open the floor up to questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I just ask that you say your name, where you're from, and keep your question as short and sharp as you can, so we can get through as many as possible.
Well, that's a great question, and indeed, the ICRC was created from the very simple idea that even in armed conflict there should be limits to human suffering, and the vision of the founding fathers was the future will be a world without conflict, and that was the initial idea that created the Red Cross, Red Crescent family movement, saying that an international organization mandated to operate in armed conflict will not be needed, but the idea, the humanitarian idea, should be retained and be anchored in national realities to work as auxiliary to the government. The problem is, unfortunately, there is no good track record of conflicts being solved or resolved politically. And we have seen over the past decades that conflicts are adding up. There are always new conflicts, and old conflicts are still there, unresolved, driving more human suffering, being more fragmented, happening in urban spaces, and affecting people and communities that are now also hardest hit by climate shocks, by the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic, by now the global ripple effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that has driven food prices, fuel prices up with record level of inflation, and making it extremely difficult for people. So on the opportunity side, I think it's about how we can really partner with other organizations in order to bridge this gap between rising humanitarian needs and shrinking capacities. And really, instead of the traditional humanitarianism, which is just dumping aid, it's about, on average, conflicts have been here for 3-4 decades. Those are the top 10 largest ICRC operations. And we have an obligation to invest more intently into building resilience of communities, equipping them with what they need to be better equipped to absorb shocks. And I think that is where our movement has a unique card to play, because we are local, we are global, and I think we can innovate in order to really optimize the limited resources that we have at our disposal.
Thank you. I might just ask a question that builds on that, because along with ICRC's work in theatres of war, of course, the ICRC also has a mandate and a legal basis that sees it, and yourself engaging in the highest levels of multilateral diplomatic fora and in humanitarian diplomacy with states across the world. So I'm wondering, based on the answer you've just given to the last question, what trends are you seeing in terms of how states are engaging on humanitarian issues at the global level? And what does that mean for ICRC and how it works? Particularly, I'm thinking, given that so many humanitarian issues are now becoming highly politicised.
No, absolutely. That's a very important question because, I mean, the ICRC always works along two axes. Of course, responding to humanitarian needs and supporting people caught up in the line of fire in armed conflict. But at the same time, there is a unique mandate that was given to us by states, the high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions. And our job is to remind states in situation of armed conflict and armed groups that they actually have obligations to follow those very simple rules that are about protecting civilians, about, sky is not the limit when you use force, and making the distinction between civilians, civilian objects, and military targets. The good news is in most of conflicts, states and also non-state armed groups relate to those rules and are not in denial of these rules. The problem and the challenge is always the gap between accepting the rules and the reality of warfare. And this is where humanitarian diplomacy kicks in, and this is where we need to engage parties to the conflict on the ground, but also states and other groups who have an influence over those parties to ensure that they are respecting the rules, because this is the best lever to reduce human suffering and humanitarian aid in the first place. And this is an important tool for the entire movement to remind that.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yeah, there's one over here.
I'm Eranda Vijay Vikrama from the Humanitarian Advisory Group. Thank you for the information shared so far. So my question is building upon some of the things that you've already referenced to around the increasing needs, but also, the challenges around funding. My question to you both, I guess, is donate potentially has always been political. But given that there's reducing aid and increasing needs, you're seeing the aid becoming more and more politicized. So as ICRC and ARC, how do you work with the donors to try and drive them towards more principled aid? And are you seeing progress in that?
No, that's, and you mentioned the question of politicization of humanitarian aid. And I think the conundrum is because parties to the conflict and the international community is failing to find political solutions to conflicts, they end up over-focusing on humanitarian aid. And the result of this is politicization of humanitarian aid. So, and here there should be a firewall, and funding is one area where we need to secure that funding comes with the understanding that the response should be really based on impartial assessment of humanitarian needs, and not, funding operations in one place rather than the other, and countering the notion that in armed conflict there are good civilians and bad civilians, because those civilians happen to live in areas controlled by the government, and those other civilians are living in areas controlled by armed groups who sometimes happen to be listed by the Security Council as terrorist groups. I think we cannot accept the notion that people, civilians, get a double punishment, first living in an area that is not receiving services from the government because it's controlled by an armed group. And second, not being able to receive support from humanitarian organizations because they are criminalized, because they are not allowed to work in area controlled by illicit armed group. And I think there is a whole work done in the fundraising space to make that case, and this is part of the humanitarian diplomacy, but there is also a lot of effort in the multilateral space to, for instance, negotiate that in resolutions there are humanitarian exemptions that would allow the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and other humanitarian organizations that are impartial to operate in spaces precisely despite sanction regimes, to operate in places like Afghanistan, to operate in places like northern Mali that is controlled by armed groups following Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State group ruling. And I think that is absolutely critical to be able to stand our ground as a principled humanitarian network, to say our purpose is to help people affected by armed conflict, irrespective where their affiliation, their beliefs, and where they live.
Kym, anything you'd like to say?
Beautifully said, Robert. So probably a different perspective, and thank you for the question and beautifully answered, Robert. For me, it's more from a systems perspective. Politicisation of donations means that sometimes donations are dwindling and come with hooks as a consequence. Rising needs means more capacity and cost, so they're moving in completely different opposite directions. And to me, that response, the systemic response, is one of actually approaching it from change rather than doubling down on what's happening. So to me, the dynamics of that vis-a-vis what Robert was saying, but from an organisation perspective and from how do you approach it, I think there needs to be new ways of approaching. So we need systemic change because that trend is increasing, not going away. And we can bury our heads and ignore that it's happening and really dig down harder and just try to go harder for donations, et cetera, but it's not changing the substance of where it's going as well. So just adding to what you were saying from a systems perspective, to me, it needs a system on top of what Robert was saying.
I've got one more question that was submitted from the audience in advance, so I'll ask that one now. Always like to reward organisation. So the question is, what do you think the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement will look like in 100 years? What will have changed and what will stay the same? So Kym, sorry, I'll hand to you first.
I was hoping you were going to say Robert. Wow. I think there's two components in 100 years' time. So we exist, the movement, as Robert's talking about, the collective, we exist to alleviate human suffering. And wouldn't it be lovely in 100 years' time there's no human suffering? So we would not exist. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So in some sense that we do ourselves out of a job because there is no human suffering. However, history teaches us and history informs us, and particularly what we were talking about recently, Robert, with a number of conflicts going around the world, that's an utopia and probably not possible. So in 100 years' time, how do we as a movement and organisation respond? I think because we respond to human suffering, it will be looking at the consequence of what is causing human suffering, the type of human suffering, then we as a movement organisation adapt to where that needs to be. So if I can project in 100 years' time, I would hope to see within that context a human connection. Humans are still the people who are alleviating human suffering that technology hasn't taken over. It's still the hand on the shoulder. It's still the human connection, the kindness, the caregiving, the safety that Robert was talking about. And two, I think technology, which is advancing at a very fast rate of knots, will completely transform the way things will be done. I'm not quite sure to how project forward in 100 years on what those technology changes would be, but my hope would be that that technology does not overtake the human effort in any way, shape or form. I also would see the fundamental principles, the foundations of the movement still to be highly relevant as they are today, as they were 160 years ago, Robert, as well. So the core fundamental principles, I'd still see them in place in 100 years' time.
Great. So there's still these elements that anchor us, and yet an ability and a need to have to adapt as the world changes. Yeah. Robert.
I fully support what Kym mentioned, and I think it's hard to speculate, but in 100 years, as a movement, I think we still have this very solid foundation around the principles and humanity, and I think we will need to stand by the principles in a very consistent way and try to ensure that the movement is not disrupted and retain a capacity to be relevant in a very complex space where clearly climate change, the effects of climate change will be felt much more massively. I mean, today we know for a fact that climate change is not triggering conflict. They are exacerbating some of the hardship people face. Maybe in 100 years, climate change could be a trigger for conflict. And the idea of the Red Cross started on the battlefield, on the ground. And I think it was then Geneva Conventions were developed for limiting suffering at sea, in the air. We now are trying to push for treaties in the outer space, in cyberspace. And I think if we want to have a movement that remains relevant, we need to be able also to operate in those new frontiers and limit suffering when conflict is waged in cyberspace, for instance. This is why we are now investing in a new delegation for cyberspace in Luxembourg to see how, in concrete terms, impartial, neutral humanitarian action can happen in the cyberspace. When we have a colleague taken hostage in Mali, we know how to engage with armed groups and how to negotiate. When you have a ransomware for the sensitive data of people, how to do it in the dark web, how to engage, how to negotiate. We need to develop these skill sets, not only as ICRC, but as movement. And I'm confident that we will maintain the relevance of those principles into the future.
Thank you very much. I think we're just about out of time. So thank you very much for those that provided questions ahead of time and for those that asked questions from the floor. It's been a really rich discussion. Thank you, Kym and Robert, for your really insightful thoughts and perspectives. And thank you, of course, to the BHP Foundation for hosting this and partnering with Australian Red Cross on this event today. And thank you all for joining. I hope we have run out of time. I think we could sit and listen to you speak for much longer, but I thought if there are burning questions, there are also a number of really fabulous colleagues of Robert and Kym in the audience. So perhaps the ICRC and Australian Red Cross colleagues, if you can just raise your hands very briefly. If you have burning questions, there are a number of people that you can also speak to afterwards who I know would love to engage on all these sorts of topics with you. So thank you very much once again. Safe travels home and all the best in your leadership journeys with these two organisations.
Thank you, Yvette.
Thank you.